I still remember the sunlight that morning, clean, ordinary, almost smug in its brightness. The base was quiet. Training flights were scheduled for later in the day. Then the radio chatter cracked open like lightning. First confusion, then silence, then words none of us would ever forget. A plane has struck the tower. At first, we thought it was an accident. Pilots make mistakes, instruments fail. But when the second report came through, a second impact, everything in the room stopped moving. My coffee hung halfway to my lips. Someone whispered, "That's no accident." By noon, the screens in the briefing hall were showing a city wrapped in smoke. I caught the faces of men I'd flown with, men who transferred to the commercial lines after service, listed among the missing. One of them, Tom, had been my roommate in flight school. Another, Jen, was supposed to be in the simulator that day. The sky that had always been my freedom suddenly looked like a weapon turned against everything I loved. When night came, the air on base felt wrong, too still, too expectant. We stood outside the hangar, heads tilted upward, watching contrails fade into darkness. Every one of us knew that life had split into a before and an after. For me, after meant purpose. I re-enlisted for the Special Operations Flight Program, driven less by anger than by an ache that wouldn't quiet. I wanted to understand how something so vast, so cruel, could have been planned. I wanted to make sure it never happened again. Years later, I would learn the name that sat like a ghost behind those attacks. Ayman al Zawahiri, the quiet Egyptian doctor who traded a surgeon's scalpel for ideology and war. He wasn't the one flying the planes, but his fingerprints were all over the blueprints. He was the mind whispering that murder could be holy. That name became a fixture in every briefing, every intelligence update. We watched him climb from bin Laden's shadow into his own empire of fear. Each time his face appeared on a screen, I felt that same hollow in my chest that had opened on the day the sky fell. When I finally retired, decades later, I thought I had left that chapter behind. But last summer, a call came from one of my former students, a drone operator now working for the agency. His voice was calm, but I could hear something trembling beneath it. "Sir," he said, "we got him." The world had kept turning, but for me, in that moment, time looped back to that blue September sky. Justice, 21 years late, had finally found its target. And that is where my story truly begins. His face first appeared in a low-resolution still during a counterterrorism lecture at Maxwell Air Force Base. The instructor dimmed the lights, and there he was, thin, bespectacled, the kind of man who might look more at home behind a clinic desk than at the head of a global terror network. Ayman al Zawahiri. The slide changed, showing him decades younger, a physician from Cairo, leading a group of radicals who dreamed of purifying their country through violence. When their movement collapsed, he fled underground, eventually finding a kindred spirit in a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. Two very different men, one a zealot doctor, the other a militant financier, joined by an idea that the United States was the enemy of their faith. I remember the instructor pausing on the next slide. Embassy ruins in Kenya and Tanzania, 1998. "These attacks," he said, "carry Zawahiri's signature. Over 200 dead, thousands wounded. For many of us in the room, it was the first time we realized the scope of the war we were already in. As the years unfolded, his name came up everywhere, whispered in intelligence cables, coded into intercepted messages. He wasn't the man in the cave waving a rifle on camera. He was the architect, the strategist who replaced passion with planning. He plotted, he delegated, and he taught others how to vanish. Every mission briefing carried some trace of him. The USS Cole attack in 2000, the 9/11 hijackers he helped recruit, the videos justifying every new atrocity. For us pilots, it was like chasing the shadow of a ghost, one that never left fingerprints, only consequences. I began keeping a notebook. Each entry was a small reminder of what his choices cost. The embassy guard who'd been 2 weeks from retirement, the sailor whose parents sent letters that came back stamped undeliverable, a little girl in Nairobi who would never walk again. Somewhere, far from all of them, the man behind the shadow was writing his own manifestos, convinced he was winning a holy war. When bin Laden was finally tracked down in 2011, we thought the story had reached its end. But out of the chaos stepped Zawahiri, older now, yet more certain than ever. He filmed messages from safe houses, calling for more attacks, urging recruits to keep the flame alive. I watched one of those videos years after my retirement. His beard had gone white, his voice thinner, but the hatred was untouched. I remember muttering to myself, "You'll run out of places to hide." My former student, the one who later called me, used to joke that the old man had become a phantom, always somewhere else, one step ahead. I told him, "Phantoms don't last forever. Shadows disappear when the light finds them." He smiled at that. "Then maybe one day will be the light, sir." He had no idea how true that would become. When I moved from cockpit to classroom, it felt like stepping from thunder into silence. No jet roar, no adrenaline hum, just a low-lit simulator bay and rows of fresh faces staring at me, waiting to be told what it meant to hunt men without ever leaving the ground. We called them the Eyes, operators who sat in temperature-controlled rooms, guiding aircraft that flew above the clouds of places they'd never visit. Their world was a mosaic of pixels, coordinates, and heartbeats captured by sensors. Yet behind every blinking red mark was a human being, sometimes guilty, sometimes not. My job wasn't just to teach them how to pilot drones. It was to teach them how to live with what they saw. The creed began as a paragraph I'd scribbled on a whiteboard after one of our first training missions went wrong. We do not kill to punish. We act to protect. Our power lies in restraint, not rage. I told them that hunting terrorists wasn't about vengeance. It was about precision, discipline, and responsibility. The weapon doesn't make you strong. Knowing when not to use it does. Every class memorized those lines before graduation. We called it the Hunter's Creed. Among them was Lieutenant Reed, the sharp-eyed kid who would one day make that call in Kabul. He reminded me of myself before the gray hair and sleepless nights, methodical, curious, quiet. He once stayed behind after class and asked, "Sir, what's it like the first time you see a target disappear?" I looked at him for a long moment. "It's quiet," I said. "Too quiet. And that silence follows you home." He nodded, and I could see the weight settle on him. That's how I knew he'd last, because he understood that our work wasn't about firepower. It was about bearing the burden that others couldn't. As the years passed, our technology changed faster than our emotions could keep up. We moved from grainy feeds to high-definition eyes in the sky. Missiles grew smarter, cameras clearer, signatures sharper. We no longer needed to destroy buildings to reach a man. We could strike a single figure standing on a balcony and leave the room beside him untouched. But with every improvement came a new moral not to untangle. What happens when you can end a life with a press of a button? When justice starts to look too much like convenience? Those were the questions I hammered into them every day. Your target isn't just a dot, I'd say. It's someone's father, brother, teacher, even if he lost his way. You don't have to pity him, but you do have to see him. That was the final lesson. To see the man, not just the mission. When I retired, Reed and I shared one last coffee under the glow of hangar lights. He said, "Sir, do you ever think we'll find Zawahiri?" I smiled faintly. "Justice is patience," I told him. "It waits longer than any man can hide." I didn't know it then, but that line would become a prophecy. It was early August when Reed's message found me. No preamble, just a brief line that made my pulse hitch. "Sir, we think we found him." For years, that name, Zawahiri, had been the background noise of every intelligence briefing, every counterterrorism update. There were rumors of him in Pakistan, then whispers from Yemen, then nothing at all. Some people at the agency thought he'd died of old age. Others said he'd merged into the noise of 1,000 small wars. To most of the world, he was a memory. But ghosts have a habit of returning to the place where they think no one is watching. Reed and his team had been tracking a courier, just an old man, walking the same route through a quiet Kabul neighborhood every morning, always stopping at the same gate before vanishing inside. The house looked ordinary, 3 stories, a veranda lined with potted plants, laundry drying in the sunlight. But when the pattern analysts ran the footage through facial recognition algorithms, they noticed something strange. A figure on the upper balcony, always stepping out at dawn, always alone, never leaving the property. He never used a phone, never appeared in public. But the posture, the height, the slow, deliberate movements, they matched. Zawahiri. When Reed called me that night, his voice was steady but thin with exhaustion. We've been watching him for weeks, sir. We've got a positive ID. The old man doesn't even know he's on our radar. Then it's him, I said quietly. He's always been too proud to hide underground forever. Reed told me about the operation, how they'd cross-checked the layout, studied the family living downstairs, confirmed there were no explosives or guards. It was the same arrogance that had betrayed so many before him, believing that, because foreign troops had left Afghanistan, the reach of justice had left with them. I remember leaning back in my chair after that call, staring at the photo Reed had sent. There he was, on that balcony, hands folded on the railing, eyes half closed in the afternoon light. The world below him moved on, children playing in the street, vendors shouting prices, unaware that one of history's darkest figures was living above their heads. For 2 decades, this man had been the phantom behind nightmares, the calm, soft-spoken doctor who'd preached holy war and taught others to die for it. Now he looked fragile, almost ordinary, and that ordinariness was what struck me hardest. Evil rarely wears the face we expect. Are you ready for this? I asked Reed. He hesitated. You told us justice is patience. Well, it's waited long enough. I could hear in his voice the mixture of reverence and heaviness that comes before a historic act, the realization that the thing you've trained for might actually happen. When we ended the call, I sat there in silence for a long time. Outside, the sky was clear, the same blue that had fallen apart all those years ago. And somewhere half a world away, that same sky was about to deliver justice through a weapon unlike any the world had seen before. The first time I heard the term hellfire, I pictured fire and thunder, the kind that levels compounds and leaves nothing but dust. But the weapon Reed's team briefed me on wasn't born from that old logic of shock and awe. It was built for a new era, justice measured in inches, not miles. They called it the R9X, though among the crews it had another name, the blade that never explodes. It wasn't a bomb in the usual sense. Its genius lay in what it didn't do. No shrapnel, no blast wave, no collateral damage. It used speed, geometry, and precision instead of heat. The engineers had stripped away everything unnecessary until what remained was purpose distilled into metal and motion. To me, it represented something I tried to teach my students all along. Power isn't in destruction, it's in control. Reed explained it during one of our late-night calls. His voice carried that quiet respect pilots reserve for good craftsmanship. Sir, you'd like this thing, he said. It's surgical. We can touch a single balcony and leave the wall beside it untouched. I imagined the operators huddled around their screens, hearts steady, breaths measured. I knew the rhythm of that waiting, the silent heartbeat between decision and consequence. What they were holding wasn't vengeance. It was the culmination of decades of learning how not to destroy everything around the target. As I listened, I found myself thinking back to the old creed written on my classroom wall. Our power lies in restraint, not rage. The R9X was the physical proof of that idea, an instrument designed not to amplify anger but to limit it. Somewhere above Kabul, a drone circled high and silent. Inside a control room half a world away, young operators watched, cross-checked, and waited. It was the same patience I had seen in their eyes years earlier, now carried to its conclusion. Reed, I said finally, whatever happens, remember why you're there. You're not avenging anyone. You're closing a chapter. He paused and then, understood, sir. When the call ended, I sat back and exhaled. I trained them to be hunters, but now they were something rare, keepers of balance in a world that too easily tips toward chaos. That night, I wrote one last note in my old flight log. Justice doesn't roar anymore. It whispers. I didn't yet know how soon that whisper would find the man who had haunted our skies for 2 decades. The night Kabul stood still was not silent. It trembled under the weight of whispers, propellers, and the fear of an unseen hand. Above the jagged skyline, the city's air hummed with the restless presence of drones circling like ghosts that refused to die. To the ordinary eyes on the ground, it was just another uneasy Afghan night. But for a select few huddled in a windowless room thousands of miles away, It was a night of judgment. Inside a command center in Langley, the air was thick with anticipation. Rows of analysts watched live feeds from the skies over Kabul, their screens flickering with infrared images, one of them marked with a pulsing red square. Al Zawahiri's hideout, the same safe house he had slipped into 2 nights earlier, believing that the city's chaos was his camouflage. Agent Nora Hemsley leaned closer to her monitor, her heartbeat syncing with the steady hum of the surveillance feed. "He's there," she said quietly, her voice steady but her fingers trembling. Pattern matches the walk, the beard length, even the limp. Across the room, General Donovan didn't move. He stared at the glowing map, his jaw locked in grim contemplation. "We confirm one last time," he said. "No civilians inside. I want a clean strike." But there were civilians, 2 young girls sleeping on the second floor. The analysts knew. The operators knew. Even Nora knew. But in the war against shadows, mercy had long been declared a weakness. Far away, in a compound on the outskirts of the city, Al Zawahiri felt it, that inexplicable chill before the storm. He had lived too long in the company of death not to sense it. The faint buzz above grew louder, like an angry hornet searching for its mark. He looked up through the broken skylight and saw a faint shimmer, a glint of steel in the night. It wasn't a bomb that came for him. Not this time. The Americans had grown clever. What sliced through the air wasn't fire. It was precision. A blade, silent and merciless, cutting through the darkness like divine retribution. The Hellfire R9X. The missile that doesn't explode. When it struck, the explosion never came. Only the sound of wind, followed by the metallic whisper of death. The walls of the compound remained intact. The night stayed quiet. Only Al Zawahiri ceased to exist, reduced to a single mark in history's ledger. In Langley, the room exhaled collectively. No cheers, no applause, just silence, the kind that comes after a storm, when even victory feels like loss. Nora removed her headset, her eyes locked on the frozen image of the aftermath. "Target eliminated," she said softly. Outside, the city went on breathing, unaware that one of its oldest ghosts had just vanished. But for every ghost that vanished, another began to take shape, born from vengeance, grief, or the simple need to remember. And as dawn crept over Kabul, painting the rooftops gold, the sky seemed strangely empty. Yet everyone knew it was only resting. When dawn broke over Kabul, it came not with song but with unease. The call to prayer echoed faintly across the rooftops, yet beneath its holy rhythm lingered the quiet knowledge that someone, had been erased from the city's breath. The neighborhood where Al Zawahiri once hid was sealed off before the sun fully climbed. Men in plain clothes arrived before the dust settled, their faces masked not just by cloth, but by fear. In the rubble-strewn courtyard, there was no sign of fire, no crater, no debris of a typical strike, only a single, jagged hole through the ceiling, as if the heavens had reached down with surgical precision. Those who came after would whisper that the Americans had used a devil's sword, a missile that kills without sound, without flame. Some said it was punishment. Others called it prophecy. Far away, in Washington, the mood was restrained. The briefing room at the Pentagon smelled of burnt coffee and satisfaction held on a leash. Screens displayed grainy before and after shots. "Mission success," read the final line on the report. No collateral damage. No civilian deaths. Just one less ghost to chase. But Nora Hemsley felt no triumph. As the meeting dispersed, she lingered before the still image. Al Zawahiri's final seconds, frozen in black and white. The intelligence community called it justice. She called it inevitability. For every man like him removed, another would rise in his place, born from the wounds left behind. In Kabul, the silence grew heavier. The 2 young girls who had survived the strike stared at the ceiling where light poured through the hole, the same hole that had taken their father's friend. They would never understand why a foreign sky had chosen their home for judgment. The villagers brought food, the imams prayed, and the rumor spread. The Americans are still watching. By nightfall, the streets hummed again, but differently. The drone's low buzz had returned, a reminder that heaven still had eyes. The insurgents buried Al Zawahiri quietly, without a name on the stone, just coordinates whispered between loyalists. In the hills beyond the city, a new voice vowed revenge. Back at Langley, Nora sat alone, staring through the glass at the lights of Virginia. She had memorized the creed of the hunters: precision, patience, purpose. But none of it quieted the sound of the silence she had helped create. The silence of a house without laughter. The silence of a mission that never truly ended. She whispered to herself, "The sky is never done watching." And somewhere over Kabul, a lone Reaper drone circled once more, its red light blinking like the heartbeat of a restless god. The news broke quietly at first, a passing headline buried beneath stories of politics and markets. Senior al-Qaeda figure killed in Kabul strike. Few paused to read beyond the headline. Fewer still remembered his name. But in the undercurrents of the world that thrived on revenge, his death was not the end. It was a spark. In the mountains beyond Jalalabad, a group of men sat in a dimly lit room, the scent of diesel and sweat thick in the air. They watched a flickering screen showing a blurred image, the remnants of al Zawahiri's safe house. A younger man, eyes cold with conviction, stood slowly. "He was our teacher," he said in Pashto, "and the Americans think killing him ends the war." Another man, older, shook his head. "The war ended for him, not for us. We are his shadow now." The camera panned away. But those words, "we are his shadow," would later surface in intercepted communications, whispered like a vow. The analysts in Langley gave the group a codename, Ember, for what rises after the fire. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, Nora Hemsley walked into the debrief room to find Colonel Raymond Hawk Merritt, once her mentor, now a man worn down by years of silent wars, waiting with a file marked confidential, post-strike effects. "They're reforming," he said without looking up. "We didn't cut off the head. We just made room for a new one." Nora leaned forward. "Do we have a lead?" Hawk smirked faintly. "We always do. The problem is, they learn faster now." He tapped a photo, grainy satellite imagery of a convoy near Kunar province. "This one's calling himself Saif al-Hayat, the Sword of Life. He was al-Zawahiri's courier, but now he's moving money, weapons, and promises." As Nora studied the image, her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from that familiar sense of inevitability. The war had changed its shape again. Shadows never die, they shift. Thousands of miles away, in the dusty streets of Kabul, the people whispered new rumors. The man the Americans killed had left behind followers who spoke not of jihad, but of vengeance dressed in new rhetoric, cleaner, smarter, digital. They were recruiting online, reaching lost youths with grief in their hearts and hatred in their feeds. For every missile that struck a target, 10 more hearts burned in resentment. The precision of justice, it seemed, had its own unintended consequences. Late one evening, Nora returned home and poured herself a glass of whiskey she no longer enjoyed. On the muted TV, a reporter spoke of renewed unrest in Afghanistan. The words blurred, fading into the hum of memory. She thought of her former trainee, Captain Reed, the one who piloted the Reaper the night of the strike. He hadn't spoken since the mission. His last message to her read simply, "We hit the mark, but I don't feel like we won." Those words haunted her now. She set the glass down and stared at the ceiling. What if justice, no matter how precise, always births another shadow? Outside, a storm gathered over the Virginia sky, thunder rumbling like distant drones. And somewhere in the mountains, Saif al-Hayat raised his hand to the horizon, the wind biting against his face. "They will come again," he murmured. "And when they do, we'll be ready." The camera of fate zoomed out, from Kabul's broken skyline to Washington's glowing map rooms, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath between two hunters, one of flesh and one of shadow. The cycle was reborn. The sound of rain always took Nora back to that night, the night she first taught her trainees the art of the silent kill. It wasn't the roar of engines or the heat of battle that stayed with her. It was the stillness after, the kind that crawled into your bones and whispered, "You've changed something you can never undo." Years had passed since the strike in Kabul, yet the echoes of that night refused to die. The agency called it a clean hit. The Pentagon called it a model of precision warfare. But Nora, she just called it the day she began to lose faith. The reports were coming in fast now. Coordinated attacks across 2 embassies in North Africa. Not large enough to make headlines in America, but sharp enough to send tremors through the intelligence community. Each strike bore a signature, subtle, but clear to those who knew what to look for. A mark, a symbol, a sword drawn in ash. Cell Ember had found its rhythm. Nora sat in the dim control room, a place that once felt like a cathedral of purpose. Now it felt like a tomb. Screens flickered in the dark, maps, drone feeds, chatter in foreign tongues. She could see the patterns forming again. Routes, convoys, camps. The hunt was beginning anew. Colonel Merritt appeared behind her. They're calling it Operation Phoenix. They want you back in advisory. The brass says no one knows their methods better than you. Nora didn't turn. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen, where a familiar silhouette moved through the night. You mean no one knows how to kill them better? Hawk paused, measuring her tone. You trained these kids, Nora. Reed, Alvarez, Patel, they all look up to you. If you walk now, they'll think you doubt the mission. She sighed. It's not the mission I doubt, Hawk. It's the meaning. He frowned. Meaning doesn't win wars. No, she said quietly. But maybe losing it does. Later that night, she drove home through the downpour, headlights slicing through the rain, like tracer rounds through darkness. On the car radio, the news spoke of progress, stability, victory. Words that once stirred her blood. Now, they only made her grip the wheel tighter. When she reached her house, she found a letter waiting on the doorstep. No return address, just her name written in careful English. Inside was a single photo, a boy, maybe 12, standing beside the ruins of a building. The back of the photo carried a handwritten note. He lived, but he doesn't speak anymore. His father died that night. You said no civilians were hurt. You were wrong. No threats. No signatures. Just truth laid bare. She sat for hours in silence, the photo trembling in her hands. The rain kept falling, as if the heavens themselves refused to stop grieving. Days later, Nora returned to Langley for what she knew would be her last briefing. She looked around the room, young pilots, sharp minds, eyes bright with purpose, and felt both pride and sorrow. You all came here to protect, she said, to make sure what happened on September 11th never happens again. I did too. But remember this, every shadow you chase leaves another behind. Every strike echoes longer than you think. The room was silent. Some understood, others didn't. She didn't blame them. They were still where she once stood, full of fire, unscarred by reflection. As she walked out for the last time, Hawk caught her by the door. You can't just leave it behind, Nora. This fight doesn't end. She smiled faintly. Maybe not, but someone has to stop fighting long enough to remember why it began. Weeks passed. She moved to a quiet cabin in Montana, far from a glow of screens and the hum of war. The air smelled of pine and forgotten prayers. Some nights, she'd sit on the porch, staring at the stars, those same skies she'd once ruled through drones and fire. She thought of Reed, of the men and women who carried her lessons into the night. She thought of the boy in the photo. She thought of Al Zawahiri, not as a monster or martyr, but as the face of a war that refused to grow old. In her mind, the hunter's creed changed. It was no longer about the perfect strike. It was about the cost of precision when humanity becomes the target. She whispered into the wind, almost like a prayer. Justice should end things, not begin them. And as dawn painted the mountains gold, Nora finally felt something she hadn't in years. Not victory, not regret, but peace. The drones still circled somewhere beyond that sky, mechanical angels keeping watch. But she no longer looked up with pride or shame, just understanding. The shadow war had taken everything, yet somehow, in the silence, she had found herself again. Years later, when the classified files were declassified, one line stood out in the final report of Operation Cyclone Hawk. Strike confirmed. 0 collateral damage reported. But somewhere in a remote Afghan village, a boy still stared at the sky and refused to speak. The world called it peace. He called it silence. And the sky, as always, kept watching.